There was a city famed throughout the world, where dwelt the chosen spirits of the age. Delhi, its name, fairest among the fair.
Near the ancient city of Delhi, Shahjahan immortalized his own name by constructing Shahjahanabad. Harassed by the scorching heat of Agra, Shahjahan decided to move the heart of his empire to Delhi. From antiquity, when it was in the press of the Mahabharata, Delhi has been the choice of capital of many a king before him, being built, uprooted and built many times over. The name Delhi may have come from the word Dil, that is, raised ground, or it may be eponymous with the name of the Hindu king Dillu, who ruled here in 327 BC. The vision of the Grand Mughal's grandest builder desired wide open spaces, and so the emperor turned to the gently rolling flatlands just above the Yamuna river near the Salimgarh fort. It was a site that conformed to the building principle of all ancient civilizations, Hindu and other, of building cities on high ground next to a river. And on the highest point of this site was built the magnificent Red Fort. So beautiful was its design and so magnificent its buildings that Amir Khusro once wrote of the city, Gar Firdaus berue zameen ast, hameen asto, hameen asto, hameen ast. If there is a paradise on earth, then it is this, it is this, it is this. The words inscribed in gold in the Diwan-e-Khas echoed the splendor of the throne room which once housed the matchless peacock throne. The walls of the city were 7 miles in circumference, flanked by strong bastions on which the army mounted artillery for defense. In the decades that followed, Shahjahanabad withstood the onslaught of invasion, civil war, and a multiplicity of rulers. In 1803, when the British took over the city from the Marathas, the basic map of the city remained unchanged. By 1850, though the Mughal Empire was in decline and the grandeur of the past missing, and the royal procession more a tamasha than a demonstration of imperial might, the Mughal dynasty still had a compelling aura which only a truly imperial line could possess. Its buildings, though bereft of its jewels, still retained some of its original splendor. The intricately carved marble lattice screens, the beauty of the hammam or royal bathhouse, and the splendor of the Diwan-e-Aam was still reflective of an era gone by. Outside the palace lay the city of poets like Zauq and Ghalib, the city of nautch girls and courtesans, where the ada and the tehzeeb spoke louder than words. The courtesans were an accepted part of society. The graceful movement of their bejeweled hands were the stuff poetry was made of. Music, poetry, singing and dancing were the fine accomplishments of the courtesans, and they lived by a code of conduct too. There was an uneasy undercurrent of rivalry between the respectable women and the courtesans. Bahadur Shah attended mehfils and mushairas, and the zafar in his name was actually his nom de plume. The mushairas held at the court were relayed to the people outside, and the rivalry of the poets Zauq and Ghalib was legendary. Every day, Bahadur Shah's court resounded to the celebration of music and poetry as poets flocked to his darbar. The Mughal power may have atrophied, but poetry, literature and Sufi music flourished. Atar or itr, fragrant essential oils from flowers, was in vogue and were kept in tiny colorful glass phials and dabbed on both by men and women. Food was a perpetual celebration. All kinds of meat, except those barred for religious reasons, were a part of the everyday diet. Kebabs and food cooked in the Bukhara style, where the food simmers in condiments and its own juices, were an art form in itself. So deep was the belief in the immortality and grandeur of the Mughal court that the Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar and his other royals kept up an opulent lifestyle despite his depleting power and finances. Since the administration of India had passed into the hands of the British in 1806, the Emperor received an annual pension of 1 lakh of rupees. 2 boulevards radiated from the palace, Chandni Chowk and Faiz Bazaar. And the merchants invariably worked in these arcades along these boulevards and lived in the upper stories. All festivals, whether Hindu or Muslim, were celebrated with equal fervor. Phool Walon Ki Sair was another instance of this composite culture which dates back to 1806. Held annually during the monsoons, it was started as an offering of a canopy of woven flowers to the Sufi saints by the Queen, after her prodigal son Mirza Jahangir was excused from exile by the British. The royal processions would leave the walled city in palanquins and on elephants, visit Humayun's tomb, the Nizamuddin Dargah, and Safdarjung's tomb, and by the evening reach the gardens of Mehroli. Dilliwalas would line the streets to get a glimpse of this procession. In the years before 1857, the relations between prominent Indians and the British officials was one of easy conviviality. The Englishmen, as well as the Muslim Umrah and Hindu caste, all subscribed to the vibrant Urdu culture. David Ochterlony, the first British resident, had 13 wives who followed him on 13 elephants for an early evening ride. Skinner and Charles Metcalfe were well versed in Urdu and English. There were many points of contact between the British and the residents of Delhi. The Archaeological Survey, set up to study the monuments and ruins of Delhi, also had a number of Indian and European members. The Delhi Bank, pioneered by Lala Chunnamal, had Hindu, Muslim and European shareholders. Though on the surface, life in Shahjahanabad was carrying on in all its effervescent spirit, rumbles of discontent were heard due to the oppressive administrative diktat of the British. In April 1857, Emperor Bahadur Shah and Nana Sahib made out a list of grievances and sent them to the Emperor of France. High land revenue, cost of litigation, stamp duties and court fees were affecting the rich landlords. The merchant class was also affected by the monopoly of the British over fine, valuable merchandise, particularly indigo and muslin cloth. Heavy custom duties and taxes were levied on other trade items. This undercurrent of bitterness turned into a spirit of rebellion. Links were established between different leaders, and an underground network of communication via symbols gained momentum. A red lotus indicated imminent bloodshed, and the flower of a plantain tree over a house indicated that that particular house belonged to a would-be martyr and the family was to be protected. The coming of the railway lines to Delhi further caused tension as markets, mosques, temples and houses were razed to the ground to lay the tracks. However, what sparked off the revolt was the suspicion that the grease used in the newly introduced Enfield rifles was from cows and pigs. Religious sentiment ran high when the British commandant in Meerut punished 85 of the best soldiers for refusing to use the rifle. They ran riot, looting and destroying British posts. They were soon joined by the civilians. They marched from Meerut to Delhi, determined to make the emperor a party to their struggle. The emperor ordered the gates of the fort to be shut and sent a message to the revolutionaries to meet him at the Firoz Shah Kotla. But in what remains a mystery even today is how the Sarwars entered through Rajghat Gate and butchered the Christians of Daryaganj. The rebels reached Chandni Chowk and they were joined by the locals chanting, "Deen ki ladai, dharam ki ladai." The furious mob attacked, looted and killed the Britishers. Begum Samru's Haveli, the Delhi College, the Delhi Gazette Press, St. James' Church were completely ravaged. May 11th, 1857 was the darkest day in the lives of the British in India. The magazine near Kashmiri Gate was deliberately blown up. Lieutenant Willoughby had seen the mutineers marching across the bridge earlier in the morning. Sensing trouble, he, with the help of 6 others, barricaded the outer gates, laid a trail of gunpowder and ignited it. The explosion was tremendous. The blast could be heard as far as Meerut. Years later, a memorial was erected near the gate in the memory of those who defended the magazine. The women and children from the cantonment and civil lines gathered at the Flagstaff Tower on the ridge. As none of them wished to leave without their husbands, there was a great deal of confusion, and many of them were separated when they were finally forced to flee in order to save their lives. Meanwhile, Brendish and Pilkington had spent the previous day trying to figure out why the telegraph lines were not working. They did not know that the mutineers had cut the lines. As the morning wore on, they realized what had happened and sent a message to Ambala. "We must leave the office. All the bungalows are being burned down by the sepoys from Meerut. We are off." The British troops, alerted, marched to Delhi. Within 5 months, the Britishers had the city back in their hands, and they let loose a period of utter ruthlessness and anarchy. Kashmiri Gate was the scene of desperate fighting. About 8,000 British troops faced over 30,000 mutineers, and after 6 days of pitched battle, Delhi was back under British rule. Several days after the assault, every native was killed. It was a war of extermination. An entire generation was wiped out in 3 days of indiscriminate looting and massacre. On the night of the fall of the city, General Wilson, the commander of the British forces, celebrated his victory with a festive dinner laid out in the Diwan-e-Khas. While he sipped champagne, the majority of Delhi's citizens fled the city to escape the wrath of the British. In the days that followed, the palace was systematically ransacked, and the few semi-precious stones in the mosaics and the engravings were prized out with bayonets. Exquisite chandeliers were smashed, and every inlay of gold on the ceiling was vandalized. The gold plate on the domes of the Moti Masjid was removed and sold for the upkeep of the army. The fairy-like pavilions and courts and gardens of Shahjahan were converted into barracks, messes and canteens, and the Divan-e-Am was converted into a hospital. Bahadur Shah was captured and in a shotgun trial exiled to Rangoon. His two sons and grandsons were captured from Humayun's tomb and shot in cold blood by Lieutenant Hudson, as he feared that the large mob following him would help them escape. Their bodies were left at the Chabutra at the Kotwali in Chandni Chowk for all to see. Thus ended the rule of the great Mughals. But even as the Pax Britannica was being proclaimed with pomp and fanfare, Ghalib wrote,
"The world is contingent. Boast not of greatness. This zenith one day defeat will depress." Why do you mock at me and ask yourself, where in the world I come from? Easterners? There was a city, famed throughout the world, where dwelt the chosen spirits of the age. Delhi its name, fairest amongst the fair. Fate looted it and laid it desolate, and to that ravaged city I belong.
As eloquent as ever, even in grief, Ghalib voiced the anguish of the Dilliwala. The ruthlessness of the British reprisal that befell Delhi in 1857 eclipsed even the carnage wrought by Nadir Shah's invasion. Khwaja Altaf Hussain Hali had later written,
O adventurer, your heart will be seared with pain and grief. Hearken to me. Do not go into the ruins of Delhi. At every step, priceless pearls lie buried beneath the dust.
In the span of a few months, Shah Jahan's capital would change more than it had in the last few centuries. Its fairy-like pavilions and palatial havelis would become just a fading memory. 1857 marks the beginning of Delhi's twilight period. The Red Fort was orphaned. With the arrest of Bahadur Shah Zafar and the execution of his sons, the Mughal dynasty had come to an end. And with it, an entire milieu had ceased to exist. Both his sons executed, the last Mughal suffered the indignity of being treated like a common prisoner. Charles John Griffiths, a witness to the events, described the pathetic condition of Bahadur Shah.
Sitting cross-legged on a cushion placed on a common native charpoy was the last representative of the great Mughal dynasty. In silence he sat day and night with his eyes cast to the ground. 3 feet from the king sat the officer on guard. The orders given were that on any attempt at a rescue, the officer was immediately to shoot the king with his own hand.
After a lengthy trial, Bahadur Shah Zafar was exiled to Rangoon, to die years later, a sad, lonely man. Delhi and its inhabitants fared no better than Bahadur Shah Zafar. Thousands were evicted from the city. Ghalib stated that hordes of men and women, commoners and noblemen, poured out of the gates of Delhi and took shelter in the numerous tombs outside. And those suspected of being sympathetic to the revolt were summarily executed, hung or blown from the mouths of cannons. And what remained of the city was ransacked in a systematic manner.
An aspect which very often we forget is that the British came to Delhi in September 1857 as conquerors. They had reclaimed the city. And this getting back of the city was accompanied by a very wide scale of plunder.
And they had these categories: who will loot what? Who will loot the wheat and the rasad, what was called? Who will loot the clothes? Who will loot the shamianas? Who will loot the doors? Everything was looted. And then people went into the houses of the nobles and took whatever they could from there. Whatever was looted was collected in one place on auction. For example, the crown of the emperor was sold for 5 whole pounds. And when it was auctioned in London, Queen Victoria bought it.
All these incidents left a deep scar in the psyche of the Dilliwalas. In a letter to a friend, Ghalib had written, "Had you been there, you would have seen the begums of the court walking about, their faces like the full moon, clothes dirty and shoes worn out. Desolate and dispirited, without the anchor of monarchy, the populace floundered. The very spirit of Delhi seemed to have died." Following the capture of the city, the troops were quartered in a number of prominent buildings: Colonel Skinner's house, Ghaziuddin Madrasa, and in an act of sheer insensitivity, the Jama Masjid. All through 1858 to 59, it was uncertain whether prayers would ever be said in the mosque. There was even a petition to remove the tank for the convenience of the Punjab infantry stationed there. Later, it was also suggested that the masjid be torn down and a cathedral be constructed in its place.
The Jama Masjid was auctioned. It was bought by the butcher of Meerut. And because he was supplying the army, so he had the money. And that's why we have it.
It was only in 1862 that the Jama Masjid was handed back to the people. The British had also moved into the fort, which in the following years would be converted from a palace to an army cantonment. The Diwan-e-Khas was made into headquarters for General Wilson. Although the proposal to pull down the fort and build a Fort Victoria was never implemented, within the palace itself, large-scale demolitions were carried out. A year later, Canning put a halt to this rampant destruction and ordered the preservation of old buildings of historical and architectural importance. Later, Lovat Fraser would describe his impressions of the fort in poignant terms.
Where once were leafy bowers, the blunt square outlines of British barracks, and at the entrance to the marble halls, quiet, alert, radiant, with ruddy English face, a young soldier of the gunners.
Half a century later, Curzon was to bemoan the fate of the palace.
The horrors that had been perpetrated in the interests of regiments and messes in the fairy-like pavilions and courts and gardens of Shah Jahan.
And he decided to take things in hand. He enacted the Ancient Monuments Act of 1904, which is the basis for the present act, which the Archaeological Survey of India implements. And he also separated the conservation work, the structural and chemical conservation work on the monuments from the Public Works Department. He formed a separate wing under the Archaeological Survey of India for this work. And this tradition has grown subsequently under Sir John Marshall, and he was one of the most illustrious Directors General.
The destruction was not confined to the Red Fort alone. Large parts of the city were also destroyed.
The Britishers then saw Shahjahanabad not as a city with which they needed to identify or integrate, but a city which they had to rule effectively as a military option if necessary. So the whole area between the Red Fort and the Jama Masjid was razed to the ground in order to create a clear line of fire from the fort.
Areas unlucky enough to fall within this were Kucha Begum, Haveli Nawab Wazir, Akbarabadi Masjid, and the palaces of Jhajjar and Ballabgarh.
There was the chalk of Sadullah Khan, Prime Minister, and this chalk had a tank in the middle, and on the sides there was a school, there was a mosque, there was a hammam, and there was his big haveli, and the havelis or the mansions of the nobles were all in that area.
During this period, a search was made of the royal records kept at the fort. All those whose names were mentioned against the British, or rather in favor of continued Mughal rule, were implicated. Luckily for Ghalib, a regular at the court, nothing incriminatory about his role in the revolt was found.
I don't know whether you know what happened to Ghalib. Ghalib came out and they said, are you a Mussalman? Mussalman ho? He said, Adha. Sharab peeta hu, suwar nahi khata. So that aroused a little humor.
But all did not go well for Ghalib. During this time, most of the palace records were destroyed. Among them, Ghalib's entire collected works. He himself had never kept his literary outpouring systematically. Until today, his entire works have not been assimilated. By January 1858, the British were allowing some people, mostly Hindus, to return to the city. Another 2 years would pass before the Muslims would be readmitted. People returned to the city to once more lose themselves in its familiar gullies and kuchas. But in their absence, Delhi had undergone a sea change.
O mirth and joy, hasten hence. Delhi is no place for you anymore. Yes, once Delhi was the center of art and science, but the art of poetry is dead, never to be born again.
With lines such as these, Khwaja Altaf Hussain Hali bemoaned the passing away of an era. In 1858, the government of India passed from the East India Company to the British Crown. Between 1858 and 1862, the city of Shahjahanabad changed beyond recognition. After recapturing the city, the British made sure that Delhi would never revolt again. Hand in hand with the total destruction, they set about restructuring the city's social order. The nobility was the hardest hit. The ruling class of Delhi, its elite, drew sustenance from the Mughal court. But the events of 1857 and the British reprisals had left them devastated. Their monarch banished and their property confiscated, they were paupered beyond redemption.
And it was very difficult to live. And the joke was that you went into the market, you went walking in Chandni Chowk, and in your pocket you had chana, 5 gram. In the other pocket you had chilgoza, which is pine kernel. And you were eating chana, but if your friend of yours came, you offered him the pine kernel, the chilgoza, because you wanted him to think that you were still eating as you used to eat. They were pathetic days.
And Delhi, after 1857, was never the same again. The British were suspicious in terms of the loyalties of the old elite. They wanted new partners in the whole project of governance. There were people who were very eager to become the new partners. These were the people who had the money but didn't have the social recognition, the social status. It was a mutually convenient arrangement. The British got new allies. The allies got a new sense of social recognition and patronage.
Thus, when the Haveli seized during the revolt were auctioned, a vast part of it was cornered by a cartel.
Most of whom were traders, people like Chunamal. And they bought everything that was sold. At one time, Chunamal owned half of Chandni Chowk and all the land up to what's called Ludlow Castle.
He had even bought the Fatehpuri Masjid for 40,000 rupees, which he later returned in 1877 for a compensation of 4 villages worth 1.16 lakhs, a profit of about 300%. It took a long time for the shadow of gloom to lift from Delhi. The population, which had dipped sharply in 1857, began to grow rapidly in the 60s. New settlements were coming up. Merchants who were displaced from the walled city were given plots in an area later to be known as Sadar Bazaar.
One very visible and traumatic, although in the long term some would say of course beneficial, change was the coming of the railways to Delhi. The railways came in the form of a breach in the walled city. A steam engine, for all that it signified at that time for the city more or less railroaded the earlier cultural insularities and suddenly brought the city in far closer proximity to an outside world.
The first train steamed into Delhi on New Year's Eve 1867. And despite large areas of the city, including Havelis and bazaars being torn down to make way for it, Delhiwalas were enthralled by the road of iron, as Ghalib called it.
Also 1857 saw the dislocation of certain civic structures which the city was used to. It created in the short term a famine because the city was in itself integrated to its hinterland which had got disrupted. So in more ways than one, with the coming of the railways, the razing to the ground of large segments of the city, the social change and so on and so forth, Delhi changed very drastically.
The famine of 1861, for instance, saw 8,000 people queue up for meals daily at the Eidgah Asylum. Ghalib wrote that 5 successive armies had ravaged Delhi. The revolutionaries of 1857, the British, the famine, the cholera.
The fifth was the fever, which took general plunder of man's strength and powers of resistance.
Despite the unimaginable hardships faced by the people, what had survived was that unique characteristic of the Dilliwala, his craving for the good things in life, his joie de vivre. At the first given opportunity, his passions for shairi, gambling and kabutarbazi came rushing back. Passions which are alive even today, refined almost to an art form. Taking to the skies from the numerous rooftops of Old Delhi, flocks clashing with each other in mock battle, they are a reminder of a past studded with splendorous courts, its kings, nawabs and poets. As the world he knew and loved disappeared, Ghalib stood midst the ruins of his beloved city.
Foliage grows from the floors and walls, Ghalib. In desolation am I, and spring has come to my house.
Time, they say, is a great healer. The atrocities suffered by the Indians at the hands of the British after the mutiny began to fade. By 1890, Delhi had established itself as the commercial capital of the Punjab. The contrast between the fading Muslim aristocracy, now fallen on bad times, and the rich Muslim merchants was striking. Mori Gate, Ajmeri Gate, Turkman Gate and Delhi Gate became a refuge for the poor. Here, the survivors of the Mughal court lived in small tenements and eked out a meagre existence. Red Fort itself had become a European ghetto. Within the walls, hideous barracks were made to house the British personnel. Indians were allowed to enter the fort only by paying a fee in order to shop at the Gora Bazaar, a parody of the Mughal Meena Bazaar. Gold and silver ornaments, curios and objects of art continued to form a major part of Delhi's export. The area in and around Chandni Chowk, famed for its fine work in jewellery and silverware, flourished. But in the absence of royal patronage, the high art suffered grievously, and the school of Mughal miniature paintings went into irreversible decline. The old canal built by Shah Jahan, which ran the length of Chandni Chowk, was bricked and trees lining the avenue were felled. The British filled the pool designed by Shah Jahan's daughter, which beautifully reflected the silvery moonlight, thereby giving Chandni Chowk, the Silver Square, its name. In its place, a clock tower was built. The call of the muezzin, who marked the time of day by the call to prayers, gave way to the Western concept of keeping time, which was far from accurate, as pigeons used to sit on the hands of the clock. As a result, it rarely showed the right time. Shah Jahan's beautifully planned city now lay dismembered. The east-west alignment of the railway lines rudely cut through the city.
The worst thing that happened was the destruction of all the gardens of Delhi, like Qudsiya Bagh, Tees Hazari, Jahanara Begum's beautiful garden and in Caravanserai in Chandni Chowk. And they brought their train, their railway line, and they broke down the Red Fort to bring it.
When the railway lines had first been proposed, Bahadur Shah Zafar had protested its entry into the city and wished for it to be built further north or end east of the Yamuna. After the mutiny, because the troops were encamped within the city walls, it was felt that the railway line too should run through the city. Earlier, visitors used to alight east of the Yamuna and approach the city across the bridge of boats, their first view being that of the majestic minarets and the imposing palace walls of the Red Fort.
If you look at old pictures of the Red Fort, you will see that the riverside is more resplendent. All the golden domes, which were stolen by the British in 1857, were on that side, on top of the Diwan-e-Khas, on top of the Khabgah, on top of the Musamman Burj. They were all the golden domes because all the traffic was by river. Now, everyone knows that if you want to move things cheap, you move them by water, but there is no money in it. So the British destroyed the waterways and installed railways instead.
In 1870, travellers alighting at Delhi railway station were greeted by the neo-Gothic railway station building. Situated on the imposing Queen's Road, the British rival to Chandni Chowk. Havelis and dwellings of the Indians were torn down, and in their place, Gothic buildings and churches were built. The town hall, with its classical facade situated opposite the railway station, was the first building to welcome visitors arriving in Delhi. The town hall was surrounded by the Queen's Garden or Company Bagh. It was a meeting place for Maulvis, Hakims, bankers and lecturers. Later, the Company Bagh became the place to preach a new religion, nationalism. Education too suffered after the uprising of 1857. Delhi College, which held its classes at the Ghaziuddin Madrasa, remained a high school till 1864 as its libraries had been destroyed and the madrasa was occupied by the police. In 1864, the college was opened and a degree from here was sufficient qualification for government jobs in Lahore. Urdu and Sanskrit were both taught at the college. However, due to a successful campaign launched by Lieutenant of Lahore College against the Delhi College, the institution was amalgamated with Lahore College through an ordinance in 1877 issued at the Delhi Darbar. This came as a great blow to the citizens of Delhi and paved the way for the Cambridge mission to set up the St. Stephen's College in 1882. The St. Stephen's College building, located near Kashmiri Gate, was run by the Cambridge mission and had teachers from Cambridge University. Though a large number of Muslims stayed away, the Hindus joined the college. In later years, Professor Saeed Haider Raza, Professor Raghubar Dayal and Master Amir Chand of St. Stephen's College spoke of the concepts of Swadeshi and Swaraj and brought about political enlightenment amongst students.
My grandfather went to St. Stephen's College and he learnt English. Like learning computers today was learning English at that time. Jyoti Prasad went to St. Stephen's Mission College in Chandni Chowk. And if he didn't go to college for 2 days, Canon Allnut, the founder, used to come and say, Lala ji, aap padhne nahi aaye. They were trying to get people to learn English because learning English gives you a mindset which they can tackle.
As a counterpoint to St. Stephen's College and the perceived missionary zeal, Shri Kishan Das Gurwala financially backed the setting up of the Hindu College. Housed in a building in Kinari Bazaar, it later shifted to a plot opposite St. Stephen's College, owned by Lala Sultan Singh. Initially, a large number of students joined the college. However, after the first year, perhaps due to bad results, the students left and rejoined St. Stephen's College. Opposite the college stood one of Delhi's finest churches. It was built by Lieutenant Colonel Skinner, who, badly wounded on the battlefield, vowed to build a church if rescued. A village woman saved his life and those of his companions by bringing them food and water, and thus, on his return, he built a magnificent church which was partially destroyed during the uprising of 1857. After his death in 1841, Skinner's body was disinterred from Hasi, his homestead, and buried in the church he had built. Civil Lines lay north of the Qudsiya Bagh. It was close to the Sacred Ridge, where the British were massacred in the uprising of 1857. Earlier, Englishmen like Ludlow and Metcalfe had built their mansions here. The area separated from the walled city by sanitized gardens was considered a safe haven for the British. Unlike its counterparts in Allahabad and Meerut, where Indians were not permitted to own land, Delhi's civil lines was owned largely by wealthy Indians who themselves chose to live in the walled city. They were absolutely amazed that the Europeans would want to live in what they considered a rural existence, and so rented out their spacious houses to the Europeans. These houses, or bungalows as they came to be known, derived their name from the word banga, Everything that came from Calcutta, the erstwhile seat of the British Empire in India, was Bangla. So, from Banga to Bangla to Bungalow. The first hotel to be constructed in the civil lines was the Maiden's Hotel, which started with a single story in 1900, adding a second floor within 7 years. Another was Hotel Cecil. Its beautiful gardens made a luxurious setting for visiting English men and women. Today, it is the residence of the brothers of the St. Xavier's School and still surrounded by the beautiful lawns. By 1908, the sprawl of the city was large enough for the chaplain to put in a request for a conveyance allowance because of the distance he had to travel. Over 6 kilometers from civil lines to the railway quarters in Paharganj. At that time, Daryaganj was still considered a backwater and was sparsely populated. In 1920, it had only the 24 houses or 24 kotis, which had been used by the officers. In 1890, Delhi had become the major railway junction in North India, and the number of cotton, spinning, ginning and mechanized flour mills and karkhanas had increased. But while commerce thrived, real power, it seemed, was beginning to ebb away. The administration of Delhi had been delegated to the Punjab, and Shahjahanabad, the erstwhile capital of the Mughals, was now merely a divisional or a district centre. Lord Lytton's selection of Delhi over Calcutta for the magnificent Darbar of 1877, at which Queen Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India, briefly brought back to the denizens of Delhi visions of its former splendour. But it was only after Queen Victoria's death in 1901 did Lord Curzon, the Viceroy, host a coronation Darbar to proclaim King Edward VII Emperor of India, thus re-invoking Delhi's glorious heritage. The Darbar came to be known as Curzon's Darbar. More than 1,73,000 people made their way to Delhi. It was a social event of the year, with the Maharajas, Rajas and Nawabs arriving in their own private rail coaches. Balls were held, troops were reviewed, and receptions were given for the ruling Indian chiefs. Beneath the pomp and show, there was a sense of hollowness. Again, there were no announcements of concessions or privileges for the Indians, though they had to bear the expense of hosting the Darbar. The partition of Bengal left the Delhi citizens aghast. A boycott of foreign goods was declared, and a distinct anti-partition agitation began, aided by a fast-growing Congress party in Delhi. In 1902, electricity came to Delhi as a result of the Darbar. With it came tram lines, which first plied in the northern area of the walled city. The tramway in Delhi was a target for much resentment, as all profits on a daily basis went into the pockets of the British, while the Tongawalas despaired and starved. A strike by these horse cart owners had the citizens of Delhi walk rather than use the tramway in solidarity with them. The British were beginning to realize the magnitude of the resentment against them, and in an effort to stem it, decided to hold yet another Darbar, this time graced by the king and queen themselves. Yet again, elaborate preparations were made to host the Grand Darbar. On the barren outskirts of Delhi, a tented city was built to house the vast numbers of invitees. and British royalty, along with their accompanying troops. Lord Hardinge decided that Indian revenues would pay for a new crown, which would then be taken back and kept at the Tower. The British had gone all out. The Salimgarh bastion of the Red Fort, where the king alighted, was lined with vividly decorated horses. Flags, banners, spears and silver maces atop empty carriages lined the route of the procession. The king, in a field marshal's uniform, astride a purebred horse, failed to make an impressive impact on the Indians, who were rather confused by his uniform and the fact that he wasn't atop an elephant like all emperors were meant to be. The procession was to begin at 11 a.m., but people weren't allowed to go in or out of their houses as early as 6 in the morning. There was a curfew on. No wonder that the king received a cold reception at the state entry. On the morning of December 12th, 100,000 people filled the great arena north of the city to witness what was to be the last and the most brilliant coronation darbar. The magnificent canopies, beneath which were seated 12,000 persons of privilege, where the colors of 1,000 turbans mingled with officers' uniforms, along with the gold-embroidered robes of the ruling chief. Facing them were 70,000 others who had been seated on a semicircular mound. At the very center of this vast concourse stood the royal pavilion, its 2 thrones raised high, visible to all, where stood their majesties. It was here that the British made the announcement of the transfer of the capital from Calcutta to Delhi.
We are pleased to announce to our people that on the advice of our ministers tendered after consultations with our Governor-General in Council, we have decided upon the transfer of the seat of the Government of India from Calcutta to the ancient capital of Delhi.
Later called the best-kept secret ever in the history of India, the King Emperor's words burst upon the multitudes who were witness to the proceedings. Consigned for more than half a century to provincial status, the city found itself raised in one stroke to the capital of the subcontinent. Delhi was once again an imperial capital whose effective authority stretched from Kashmir to Colombo and Calcutta to Karachi. Half a million people had gathered to get a glimpse of the king, emperor and the queen as they stood on Shah Jahan's balcony at the Red Fort just before they laid the foundation stone of the new capital.
Many capitals have been inaugurated in the neighborhood of Delhi, some of which are so ancient that their origin is lost in the midst of antiquity. But none has ever arisen under happier auspices than those which attend the ceremony which your imperial majesties are about to perform. And assuredly, none ever held promise of greater permanence or of a more prosperous and glorious future.
Days later, when the Medina finally set sail with their majesties heading westwards into the twilight, in Delhi, a breeze whispered softly across the empty Darbar amphitheatre, and the moon's rays played on the shimmering domes of the tombs, which gave the plains its title, the Graveyard of Dynasties. Beneath its majestic domes lay a simple sarcophagus, a silent testimony to the common end of all earthly splendor and imperial glory. To give concrete shape to the imperial designs, a town planning committee was formed with Edwin Lutyens as the architect. Described by some as an expensive country house specialist, what Lutyens lacked in experience, he made up for with his strong connections through Lord Lytton, his father-in-law.
Being well connected is a very important part of the architectural practice in those days as well as it is today. And one cannot really fault someone for being well connected. And that he was the builder of expensive country houses is no reason to reject him.
The rest of the committee comprised of, among others, Herbert Baker, John Brodie, George Swinton and Thomas Ward. The first task faced by the town planning committee was the selection of a site. When the foundation stone was laid by King George V during the coronation darbar in 1911, it had been assumed that the new capital would be built alongside the civil lines. But Lutyens was given complete freedom to choose the site.
If you look at the darbar area, you will see that it's a relatively flat kind of site, and the place had difficulties in drainage as well.
As stated in the Town Planning Committee report, what was of prime importance was that the new site be in close physical and general association with the present city of Delhi and the Delhis of the past. Perched on elephant backs in the sweltering heat of May, the committee would make daily forays from the Maiden's Hotel to scout for a suitable site. They would be constantly on the move from almost 5 in the morning till midnight. "We are so busy," Lutyens complained, "that there seems to be no time for anything." The heat and the pressure mounted, tempers often flared, and the differences emerged in the committee over the Battle of the Sites, as it was called. But as the dust settled, only one possible site emerged: Raisina Hill.
The site that was finally chosen was favored by the Viceroy, and south of Shahjahanabad was seen anyway as a better location because it had much better drainage.
Now, Shah Jahan's architects had also seen all this area. Why didn't they build there? Because they had dug pits to see what the foundations were like. And they found there was too much salt in this area. And it would climb up, which everybody who lives in New Delhi will tell you that there is shora coming up the walls.
By 1914, the work had started in full swing to construct a city that was to accommodate about 57,000 people. 6 million cubic feet of stone, 100,000 cubic feet of marble, and 700 million bricks would go into building the imperial capital. The Raj, it seemed, was here to stay. Despite his uneasy relationship with Indians, Lord Hardinge had numerous ideas and the foresight to give the city a practical and aesthetic shape. Under his instructions, the committee incorporated tree-lined roads and old monuments like the Purana Qila. Later, commenting on Hardinge's role, Lutyens declared his command that one avenue should lead to Purana Qila and another to the Jama Masjid was the father of the equilateral and hexagonal plan. Lutyens, ever critical of Indian architecture, felt that nothing Indian was constructed to last, not even the Taj. He was looking at Western styles for the buildings, but due to political exigencies, was persuaded to come up with a style symbolic of both Eastern and Western architecture.
But the interesting thing about the way he adopted the style is that he deflected the main Hindu-Muslim sources from these main Hindu-Muslim sources and adapted things which are Buddhist in origin.
The British experience has been very poor. Their domes look like solar topis. They have no elegance. You look at the dome of even Safdarjung, which is a poor monument, and you look at the domes of the North Block, South Block, except for one thing. If you are sitting in the finance secretary's room on a cold day in January and you look out and it's misty, you might think that you are in Pall Mall, you are in London. You know, nostalgia hai, nothing more.
The buildings that came up were a fusion of the East and West, with darker, heavier-looking stones forming the base, while lighter-coloured stones were placed above. Thus, the colour of the facade perceptibly lightened as it rose from the ground. In 1929, Government House became Viceroy's House. The building has the openness of a summer house, despite the fact that it was built like a fortress against the Indian climate. Though it is a behemoth of some 340 rooms, the place is still kin to the humble bungalow. Despite its grandeur, beauty and elegance, many critics feel that it is marred by a glaring mistake of conception. Lord Hardinge had originally envisioned the viceregal residence in solitary majesty atop Raisina, seen from every part of the city.
Actually, there is supposed to have been a huge debate at that time about how the palace would be viewed from the main vista, main central vista. And Lutyens was very keen that the building should be located on the peak of the Raisina hill, from where it has a kind of an unassailable position in terms of this adjoining landscape. And he even made sketches which located the main viceregal palace on top of the hill, showing how relatively in terms of height it would be still dominant from, say, the Jama Masjid or the Red Fort.
But it was finally decided that the Secretariat buildings would be placed on Raisina as well. As a result, the viceregal palace was pushed back, obscuring it for part of the Kingsway. But in all respects, the viceregal establishment was appropriately imperial in scale. And at the close of British rule in 1947, over 2,000 persons served Lord Mountbatten at Viceroy's House. And altogether more than 6,000 persons had permanent housing in its compound. As it took shape, considerable interest arose in the naming of the new city. Various names had been suggested for Imperial Delhi, and out of Raisina, Delhi South, and New Delhi, the King Emperor decided that the official capital would be called New Delhi. With the new city came up the palaces of the princely states. While building restrictions ensured that none of the native palaces would overshadow the viceroy's house, no such constraints hampered the splendid interior decorations. Baroda House, for instance, had furnishings in an Anglo-Saxon style. The plumbing was American, the cook and the bandmaster French. The table linen was from Belfast, the dinner service was fashioned in Bond Street, and all other frills were no less than the highest nobility in London. In his book, Maurice de Cobra describes the fabulous wealth of these Maharajas. With the Rajas, a lakh of rupees is a minimum, below which it is not respectable to descend. A prince who has any self-respect ought rather to juggle with a crore. The Delhi season would take place from end January to mid-April, about 2.5 months packed with state dinners, lunch parties, and engagements like the Imperial Horse Show, the Delhi Hunt Ball, and the Viceregal Ball. As the creme de la creme of society descended upon it, New Delhi and its magnificent palaces would come alive. Princes without palaces would occupy entire floors of the Maidens and the Cecily. While submitting the final plans of New Delhi, the Town Planning Committee had made provisions for a grand shopping plaza. The Connaught Place area was to have within it hotels, business establishments and cinemas. But in spite of these grandiose plans, it initially found few investors and took about 14 years to be constructed.
In its original conception, it was even supposed to contain the railway station, and that would have completely changed the complexion of that space. But for some reason, they decided to move the railway station further back, closer to Old Delhi, and which in fact pulled out the main magnet of growth from Connaught Place. In fact, that was the reason why it developed in such a slow manner.
Connaught Place was completed in 1934 and since then has become an enduring symbol of Delhi. In February 1931, New Delhi was ready for the inauguration ceremony. It had taken over £10 million and 2 decades, as against the 4-year time frame, to build New Delhi. The inauguration ceremony itself was in keeping with the pomp and pageantry associated with the empire. Massed bands, trumpet fanfares and thunderous 31-gun salutes accompanied the arrival of the Viceroy and the unveiling of the Ashokan columns in front of the secretariats. Despite the grandeur of the spectacle, the ceremonies rang hollow. It was evident to many that the once invincible British power was now on the decline. A quarter of a century after the conception of Imperial Delhi, in which he took such a conspicuous part, King George V was dead. A 73-foot monument to the late monarch was designed by Lutyens and was placed near India Gate, a stately conclusion to Kingsway. After independence, the statue was removed to Coronation Park, where it now stands. The British had sought to build the new city as a symbol of the permanence of their empire. Instead, they had to leave less than 2 decades later. Earlier, in 1920, Georges Clemenceau had gazed upon the half-built city and commented that this would be the finest ruin of them all. With the surrender of the Japanese on August 14, 1945, the Second World War came to a close. And with it ended one of the most heroic yet unsung struggles for India's independence. Consisting of Indian soldiers held prisoners of war by the Japanese, the Indian National Army, or INA, was led by the charismatic Netaji Subhash Bose. Fired by his slogan, "Chalo Dilli," the INA put up a valiant fight in Imphal and Burma. खुशी के गीत गाए जा, ये जिंदगी है कौम की, तो कौम पे लुटाए जा, कदम कदम बढ़ाए जा, खुशी के गीत गाए जा, ये जिंदगी है कौम की, तो कौम पे लुटाए जा, तू शेर हिंद आगे बढ़ मरने से फिर भी तू न डर, उड़ा के दुश्मनों का सर जो शे वतन बढ़ाए जा, तू शेर हिंद आगे बढ़ मरने से फिर भी तू न डर, उड़ा के दुश्मनों का सर जो शे वतन बढ़ाए जा, कदम कदम बढ़ाए जा, खुशी के गीत गाए जा, ऐ जिंदगी है। However, when their allies, the Japanese, surrendered, they too had to lay down their arms. The British, on their part, refused these men the status of prisoners of war and treated them as traitors and deserters instead. As rumors spread throughout the country about the fate of the INA soldiers, 3 of them were selected for exemplary punishment. On the 5th of November, 3 INA officers, Captain Shahjahanabad Khan, Lieutenant G.S. Dillon, and Captain P.K. Sehgal, were brought to trial on the charge of waging war against the King Emperor of India. The 17-member Defence Committee consisted of, among others, Dr. K.N. Karju, Sir Tej Bahadur Sapru and Jawaharlal Nehru. Through the 2-month trial, the defence strove to prove that what was on trial was the right to wage war with impunity on the part of a subjective race for their liberation. But the verdict of the court-martial was a foregone conclusion. and on the 31st of December 1945, all three were pronounced guilty of waging war against the King Emperor and were sentenced to transportation for life. However, the order was later repealed and they were released. In a way, this was the precursor of the things to come. Britain, in having won the war, had been drained of its vitality. The Indian freedom struggle had gained in intensity. And at midnight of the 14th of August, 1947, Pandit Nehru, India's first Prime Minister, addressed the nation.
Long years ago, we made a tryst with destiny, and now the time comes when we shall redeem our pledge, not wholly or in full measure, but very substantially. At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom.
And in the morning of the 15th, he unfurled the tricolour on the ramparts of the Red Fort.
जनगण मन अधिनायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता पंजाब सिंध गुजरात मराठा द्राविड़ उत्कल बंगा विंध्य हिमाचल यमुना गंगा उच्चल जलधि तरंगा तब शुभ नामे जागे तब शुभ आशीष मांगे गाहे तब जय गा